We'd decided on the hotel as a treat. Just one night, New Year's Eve, away from the chaos of the kids. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had good reviews online. Clean, quiet, and perched at the edge of a little village surrounded by woods, a place to relax, reset, and start the year on a peaceful note. The room was fine. Small, with a bed that squeaked when you moved, but the kind of cozy that feels intentional. The carpet smelled faintly of cleaner and the wallpaper was a little faded, but the radiator worked, and the bathroom was spotless. After dinner in the hotel restaurant, we came back to the room, poured a glass of wine each, and sat in bed watching the TV. Outside, the wind was starting to pick up, rattling the windows. It was around 10 when I noticed the knocking. At first I thought it was coming from the hallway, just a guest passing by or a door being closed somewhere else. But it came again, faint but distinct, from the wall to the left of our bed. The sound was steady, like someone rapping their knuckles lightly against wood. I figured it was just someone in the room next door and tried to ignore it. It didn't stop. The sound carried on, coming and going in bursts, always faint but persistent. I mentioned it to my partner, but they waved it off, saying it was probably nothing. I wanted to believe them. After all, it was an old building. Old buildings make noises. Pipes, wind, guests moving around. By midnight, the knocking had grown louder. It was sharper now, more insistent. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to hear if there was a voice or even movement on the other side. Nothing, just the knocking and the faint sound of the wind outside. I couldn't sleep. Every time I started to drift off, the sound would come again, jolting me awake. Around 2 a.m, I decided to call down to the front desk. The woman who answered sounded tired but polite. When I mentioned the noise, she paused for a moment before telling me that the room next door wasn't occupied. The words made my stomach twist. She said it so plainly, so casually, as though it were just another fact about the hotel. I thanked her and hung up, feeling the weight of the silence that followed. The knocking came again, louder now. This time it didn't stop. It was steady, rhythmic, almost purposeful, as though whoever or whatever was making it wanted me to come closer. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I got out of bed, pulled on my dressing gown, and went into the hallway. The lights flickered slightly, the dim bulbs casting long shadows against the wallpaper. The corridor was quiet, except for the muffled sound of the wind outside. I stopped in front of the door to the room next to ours. It looked the same as every other door in the hallway. Same brass number, same dark wood. The knocking was louder now, but there was no other sound. No voices, no creaking floorboards, nothing to suggest anyone was inside. I raised my hand to knock back, hesitated, then let it fall to my side. I didn't want to know what might answer. Instead, I stepped closer, pressing my ear against the wood. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt before, like the entire building was holding its breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and then I heard it, a whisper, faint and low, so soft I couldn't make out the words. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my chest. The door remained closed, the hallway empty. I stood there for a long moment, listening, waiting for the sound to return, but it didn't. I went back to the room, locked the door, and crawled into bed. The knocking started again, almost immediately, louder now, as though it was coming from inside our walls. When we checked out the next morning, the woman at the front desk asked if everything had been all right. I wanted to tell her about the knocking, the whispers, the way the room next door seemed to pulse with something I couldn't explain, but I didn't. We left the hotel and didn't look back. New Year's Day brunch was a tradition among our group. Every year, no matter how wild the celebrations the night before, we'd gather around someone's table, nursing hangovers and swapping stories about who'd embarrassed themselves most at the party. This year it was at Emma's house. She'd outdone herself, a spread of pastries, bacon, eggs, fruit, enough to feed twice as many people as were there. The atmosphere was light, everyone talking over one another as we pieced together fragments of the previous night. Someone found a questionable photo on their phone. Someone else confessed to drunkenly trying to sing karaoke without a machine. The usual. I was halfway through my coffee when the vibe shifted. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of tension. Sarah, sitting opposite me, was rummaging through her handbag with increasing urgency. Then she glanced at the table, her brow furrowed. I didn't think much of it. A misplaced phone wasn't exactly unusual after a heavy night. But then Mark mentioned his phone was missing too. He'd been scrolling through pictures a moment ago, but now it wasn't on the table where he'd left it. Emma joined in, saying she couldn't find hers either. The conversations tapered off, replaced by the sound of people checking pockets, lifting cushions and peering under furniture. I reached for my phone, which I'd left by my plate, and felt my stomach sink. It wasn't there. At first, we tried to laugh it off, a shared joke about the hangover thief, someone playing a prank. But the mood kept shifting, a creeping unease that wormed its way through the room. There were 8 of us, and by the time we'd all checked, 5 people couldn't find their phones. Emma suggested calling one of the numbers. A couple of us still had our devices, so we tried. No luck. The calls didn't even ring, they went straight to voicemail. That's when Sarah said her laptop was still open in the corner. She rushed to check it, her face pale. We all gathered around as she clicked through her email, then her social media. Her voice trembled as she pointed to a series of posts on her account. Private messages, some deeply personal, some downright embarrassing, had been made public. It wasn't just hers. Mark grabbed the laptop next and found the same thing on his profile. Conversations he'd had, things he'd never intended to share, were now out there for everyone to see. Panic started to ripple through the group. Who would do this? How? We were the only ones here, and none of us had left the table for more than a minute or two. It didn't make sense. Emma's house wasn't big, but we searched it anyway. Every room, every cupboard, nothing. The windows and doors were locked from the inside. No sign of a break-in, no sign of anyone else having been there. The unease in the air thickened. We started turning on each other, accusing glances and half-hearted defenses. Was someone here pulling a twisted prank? But the sheer scope of it, the way it targeted multiple people at once, didn't add up. Sarah checked her account again and gasped. A fresh post had appeared just seconds ago. We all froze. It was a message between her and her partner from months earlier, a raw and emotional exchange that she swore she'd deleted. More posts started cropping up. Emma's voice messages to her sister, Mark's drunken text to an ex, all of them coming from their accounts in real time, but none of them had their phones. I felt an icy knot in my stomach and glanced around the room. The kitchen window caught the light just right, and for a split second I thought I saw a reflection, something behind us, just out of view. We didn't stay long after that. One by one, we made our excuses and left. Some of us walked, some of us drove, but none of us said much. As I reached the door, I realized my phone was in my pocket after all. It buzzed as I stepped outside, and when I checked, there was a new message on the screen. I didn't open it. The cabin was meant to be our little escape. After a year of chaos, a quiet New Year's in the mountains sounded perfect. It wasn't fancy, just a small wooden place tucked into the trees, with a big fireplace and wide windows that looked out onto endless snow. We'd planned it weeks in advance, stocked up on supplies, and driven up the winding road as the weather started to turn. The snowstorm rolled in hard and fast that evening, blotting out the sky and piling drifts against the cabin walls. By the time we woke up the next morning, we were completely snowed in. The road was gone, buried under feet of snow. Even the trees seemed to disappear, just dark shapes barely visible through the white haze. We weren't worried at first. We had food, wood for the fire, and enough blankets to keep warm. The kids thought it was exciting, like an adventure. But by the second day, the novelty had worn off. The snow didn't stop, and the wind howled constantly, making the cabin creak and groan like an old ship at sea. The food started to look less plentiful, and the cold seeped into every corner, no matter how much we kept the fire going. It was late in the afternoon when I noticed something odd. A draft, cold and sharp, coming from the floor near the kitchen. I thought it might be a crack in the foundation or a loose board, but when I crouched down to check, I found a small trapdoor hidden under the rug. I hesitated, then lifted it. The smell hit me straight away, damp and earthy like wet leaves and rotting wood. There was a ladder leading down into darkness, and for a moment I thought about just closing it up again, but curiosity won out. I grabbed a torch and climbed down. The basement was cramped, with low beams and dirt walls that looked like they'd been dug out by hand. Old boxes and rusted tools were scattered everywhere, along with thick cobwebs that clung to my clothes as I moved. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but something about the place felt off, like it didn't belong to the rest of the cabin. Then I saw it. At the far end of the room, past a stack of mouldy crates, was a small bed, just a mattress on the floor really, with a heap of blankets that looked recently used. Next to it was an old lantern and a pile of food wrappers. My stomach twisted. Someone had been staying down here. I backed away quickly, my torch shaking in my hand. The idea of someone hiding under our feet while we slept made my skin crawl. I climbed back up, shut the trap door and locked it. I told myself it was probably some drifter who'd been using the cabin before we arrived, someone caught out in the weather. Maybe they'd moved on when we showed up, but that night I couldn't sleep. Every noise seemed louder, the wind against the windows, the crackle of the fire, the creak of the cabin settling. Around midnight I thought I heard something else, faint but distinct, a soft scraping like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from below. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. The noise stopped, then started again, more insistent this time. I crept out of bed, heart pounding, and checked the trap door. It was still locked, but the draft was stronger now, icy and sharp against my bare feet. I woke my partner and we decided to check the basement together. I held the torch while they held a poker from the fireplace. We unlocked the trapdoor and climbed down, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air down there was colder than before and the smell was worse, thick and sour. The bed was empty, but the blankets had been disturbed, dragged halfway across the room. The food wrappers were gone. At the far end of the basement, where the wall met the floor, there was a small tunnel I hadn't noticed earlier. It was barely big enough for someone to crawl through, but it looked fresh, the dirt still loose around the edges. I shone the torch into the tunnel, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. Something shifted deep in the shadows, too quick to make out. We didn't wait to see more. We climbed back up, locked the trapdoor again, and pushed the heaviest piece of furniture we could find over it. The snowstorm finally eased the next morning, but we didn't dare leave the cabin. Not yet. We stayed close to the fire, listening, waiting. The sound came again that night, scraping, closer now, followed by faint whispers that seemed to rise up through the floorboards. We tried to convince ourselves it was just the wind. When we left the cabin the next day, we didn't look back. I don't know what we would have seen if we had. It was just past 11 when the noise started. The kind of racket you'd expect on New Year's Eve, but not at this level. It wasn't just the usual cheering and fireworks in the distance. This was full-on music, stomping, shouting, like someone had packed a nightclub into the flat below mine. At first, I tried to ignore it. I put the TV on louder, but it didn't help much. The bass thudded up through the floor, rattling my coffee table. Every so often I could hear glass breaking. Laughter that felt more aggressive than celebratory. By the time it got close to midnight, I'd had enough. I called the police. It felt petty, but I didn't know what else to do. I could have gone down there myself, but I wasn't in the mood to argue with a bunch of drunk strangers. The operator said they'd send someone over. I hung up and waited, the noise showing no signs of letting up. When the officers arrived, I could hear their boots on the stairs before the knock on my door. They asked a few questions, how long it had been going on, how many people I thought were down there. I didn't have any clear answers. All I could say was it was loud enough to shake my ceiling, and it felt like there had to be dozens of people. They went down, and for a moment the sound of their knocking was louder than the party. I waited, listening, imagining what they'd find. The music cut off abruptly, no gradual fade, just silence. The officers came back a few minutes later, looking confused. They told me the flat was empty, no sign of a party, no people, no mess, not even the smell of alcohol or smoke. I told them they must have missed something, but they shook their heads. They even let me follow them down to see for myself. The flat door was open when we got there. The place was dark, empty. I stepped inside, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a sofa or a curtain, but there was nothing. The furniture looked untouched, the surfaces clean. It didn't even look like anyone lived there, just bare rooms with the faint smell of dust and damp. The officers didn't have much else to say. They checked the locks, asked if I might have heard the noise coming from somewhere else. I knew what I'd heard. It had been coming from right here. They left, after telling me to call again if it started up. I went back upstairs, still rattled. The silence hung heavy, almost pressing against my ears after the hours of noise. I double-checked my own door was locked, then sat in the living room staring at the floor as if that might give me answers. It didn't take long for the sound to return, not as loud this time, but unmistakable. Music, faint at first, growing steadily louder. I froze listening as the bass picked up again, the stomping and laughter following soon after. It wasn't just the same kind of noise, it was exactly the same. The same rhythm, the same bursts of glass breaking, the same shouted voices, like a recording playing on a loop. I called the police again, my hands trembling as I tried to explain. They promised to send someone back, but this time I didn't wait for them to arrive. I went down to the flat myself. The noise was deafening as I stood in front of the door, the kind of volume you could feel in your chest. I raised my hand to knock, hesitating for a moment before making contact. The sound stopped again, cutting out so abruptly it left me dizzy. I tried the door handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily under my hand. The flat was just as empty as before, silent, dark, untouched. I stepped inside, feeling the chill of the air. The space felt wrong, as if the walls were leaning in ever so slightly, the shadows shifting at the edges of my vision. I stood there, waiting, straining to hear anything. Nothing. Just the faint hum of my own pulse in my ears. Then the door clicked shut behind me. The music started again. The beach was perfect for New Year's. Quiet, tucked away, and out of sight from the tourists and partygoers who crowded the town. We'd brought everything we needed: logs for a bonfire, cheap cider, a Bluetooth speaker, and set up just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The cold bit at our faces and fingers, but the fire roared to life quickly, pushing back the chill and painting the sand with a warm golden glow. There were 6 of us. We'd spread out blankets, jackets, and bags around the fire, forming a loose circle. The night had that special kind of stillness you only get in winter, where every sound carries, every movement feels sharper against the backdrop of silence. The waves lapped at the shore, steady and rhythmic, and the sky was impossibly clear, stars scattered like broken glass. We laughed, drank, and swapped stories. Someone played music from their phone, the soft crackle of the fire mingling with the bass line. It felt good to let the year fade away with people I trusted, people who'd been there through all the mess and madness of the last 12 months. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and for a while, everything felt right. It must have been just before midnight when I noticed him. At first, he was just a shape, a dark blot at the edge of the firelight, sitting cross-legged in the sand. I thought maybe it was a trick of the shadows, or someone from another group wandering over, but no one else seemed to see him. He was far enough out that I couldn't make out his features, just the vague outline of a man sitting perfectly still. I tried to shake it off, telling myself he wasn't really there, but my eyes kept drifting back to that spot. The firelight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw his face, pale, like bone washed up from the sea. His head was tilted slightly, watching us. I nudged the person next to me and gestured towards the figure. They squinted, frowning, but when they turned back to me, it was with a shrug. They didn't see anything. The music continued, the laughter too, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was there, watching, waiting. The fire popped loudly, startling me. I looked again. He was closer. Not by much, but enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it now. He hadn't stood, hadn't moved in any way I'd noticed, but the space between us had shrunk. He was just outside the reach of the firelight, the sand around him untouched by the glow. I glanced at the others, but no one seemed to notice. They were lost in their own little world, passing a bottle back and forth, singing along to the music. I felt a strange twist of anger in my chest. How could they not see him? How could they not feel it, the way the air had changed, turned cold despite the heat of the fire? The flames wavered again, dimming slightly, and the figure shifted. He didn't stand, didn't crawl, but somehow he was closer again. I could see him more clearly now. His clothes were wrong, old-fashioned in a way I couldn't place, hanging loose on a frame that seemed too thin. His hands rested on his knees, fingers long and motionless, his head tilted again, just slightly, as though he was curious about us. I opened my mouth to say something, to shout or scream, but the words stuck in my throat. The music had stopped. I hadn't noticed it fade, but now the absence was deafening. Even the waves seemed quieter, their gentle rhythms swallowed by the growing silence. One of the others stood, stretching, and glanced out towards the water. They froze for a moment, their silhouettes stiff against the firelight, before turning back to us. They didn't say anything, but their expression changed. Confused, uneasy. I followed their gaze and saw the figure again. He was standing now, at the very edge of the firelight, close enough that I could see his eyes. They didn't look human. Too dark, too deep, like staring into the bottom of a well. They flicked over each of us in turn, and for the first time that night, the fire seemed to falter, guttering like a candle caught in the wind. No one moved. The air had turned icy, each breath visible in the thin light. The figure took a step forward, slow and measured, and I swear I could hear the crunch of sand beneath his feet, though it didn't match the rhythm of his movement. He was almost in the circle now, close enough that I could see the sharpness of his features, the unnatural stillness of his face. The fire sputtered once more and went out. The darkness swallowed us whole. We'd parked up just before 11, a group of us crammed into Darren's old Ford Fiesta, excited for the fireworks. The car park was massive, one of those sprawling ones near a shopping centre that closed early for the holiday. We thought it was perfect, plenty of space, a decent view of the city skyline, and quiet enough to enjoy ourselves without being disturbed. A couple of other cars dotted the lot when we arrived, but nothing that suggested much activity. The night was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you've piled on. We sat in the car, passing around bags of crisps and cans of lager, the windows fogging up from our breath. By the time midnight approached, the sky was clear and still, a deep, inky black speckled with stars. The fireworks started right on the hour, a burst of colour lighting up the skyline. We cheered, clapped, and craned our necks to watch the explosions ripple across the night. It was one of those moments where everything feels bigger than it is, the kind you're glad to share with your mates. When the last firework fizzled out, leaving trails of smoke against the dark sky, we decided to head back. Darren turned the key in the ignition and the Fiesta coughed, then fell silent. He tried again with the same result. A few of us laughed, thinking it was typical of his car to act up when we needed it most. Then I noticed the other cars. Earlier, there'd been lights, movement, the occasional muffled sound of music or voices. Now they were still. No engines rumbling, no brake lights flickering, just hulking, lifeless silhouettes scattered across the lot. It wasn't just that they were empty, it was the way they looked. Like they'd been abandoned, left to rust in a graveyard of concrete and tarmac. Darren got out to check under the bonnet, swearing under his breath about the Fiesta being temperamental. The rest of us stayed put, the cold gnawing at our hands and feet. The silence outside felt heavier now, pressing in on the car like a weight. I rolled down the window a crack, just to hear something other than the sound of my own breathing. That's when I heard it, a faint scrape, like metal dragging against concrete. It came from somewhere off to the left, near the far edge of the lot. I glanced at the others, but no one else seemed to notice. Darren slammed the bonnet shut, muttering about needing a jump start. The scrape came again, louder this time. It wasn't rhythmic, but it had an odd pattern, stopping and starting as if whatever was making it was unsure of itself. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness, but the car park lights were dim, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to twist and shift with the wind. Then I saw movement, not close, but enough to make my skin prickle. A shape, low and jagged, weaving between the cars. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it wasn't walking, not like a person would. It moved unevenly, almost dragging itself along. I nudged Sam sitting next to me and pointed. He frowned, peering through the foggy window. "What?" he asked, but before I could answer, the shape disappeared behind one of the larger SUVs parked nearby. Darren got back in, slamming the door behind him. He turned the key again, but the car remained stubbornly dead. The rest of us were starting to feel the unease now, shifting in our seats, glancing at the shadows outside. Another sound, this one closer, a low, scraping crunch like gravel being ground underfoot. It came from behind the car. I twisted in my seat, staring out the rear window. The lot looked the same. Dark, empty, sprawling, but something felt wrong. The shadows weren't where they should have been. Or maybe there were more of them now, creeping in closer. Darren tried the car again, swearing loudly when it refused to start. He hit the steering wheel in frustration, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silent lot. Then the lights flickered, not in the car, the overhead ones in the car park. They dimmed for a moment, casting everything into near darkness, then came back, weaker than before. The scrape sounded again, this time from the front of the car. We all froze, heads snapping forward, staring out into the gloom. The shape was closer now. I could see it clearly, a hunched, angular figure dragging itself forward on all fours, or what looked like fours. Its limbs were too long, bending in ways that didn't make sense. It stopped just beyond the pool of light from the nearest lamppost, as if it knew exactly how far to stay out of sight. No one spoke. Darren didn't try the engine again, and we just sat there, trapped by the growing, suffocating awareness that whatever this thing was, it wasn't going away. And then the lights went out completely. It was my partner's idea to go hiking on New Year's Day. A fresh start, she called it. A chance to shake off the cobwebs of the old year and step into the new one with clear heads. I wasn't keen on it at first. January in the Peak District wasn't exactly my idea of fun, but her enthusiasm was contagious, and the promise of a quiet walk away from everything won me over. We set out early, bundled up in layers against the chill. The frost clung to the ground like shards of glass, crunching underfoot as we followed the trailhead into the woods. The air had a crispness to it, biting but invigorating, the sort of air that made you feel alive. The path wound its way through the trees, thick branches overhead, blotting out most of the sky. The forest seemed to absorb sound, muffling the usual chatter of birds and the distant hum of civilization. It was peaceful in a way that teetered on the edge of unsettling, just us. The creak of branches and the steady rhythm of our boots against the frozen earth. We'd been walking for an hour or so when the GPS on her phone started acting up. At first it just froze, the little blue dot stuck in place no matter how far we walked. Then it started to jump around, leaping to impossible locations, half a mile west, 2 miles east, before disappearing altogether. No matter, we had the map, or so we thought, until we realized we'd left it in the car. I joked about it being the sort of thing that always happened in horror films. She didn't laugh. We carried on anyway, sticking to the trail as best we could. But the woods were a labyrinth, each turn looking much like the last. The trees crowding closer together, their gnarled roots snaking across the ground like veins. The quiet pressed in heavier now, more oppressive. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving. It was around then that we noticed the sound. Faint at first, so faint we almost didn't catch it. Footsteps, not ours. They didn't match our pace. Too heavy to be an animal, too erratic to be the echo of our own movements. They came from somewhere behind us, stopping whenever we stopped, resuming when we did. We didn't speak about it, not directly. We just quickened our pace, as if doing so would outdistance the sound. But it didn't. It stayed with us, dogging our steps like a shadow. Her phone was useless by now, a blank screen refusing to respond no matter how many times she tapped it. Mine had no signal either. The little bars that were supposed to keep us tethered to the world were gone, leaving nothing but an empty, mocking void. The trail split into two, and we chose one at random. The footsteps followed. I looked over my shoulder more than once, expecting to see someone or something emerging from the trees, but there was nothing there, just the endless forest stretching out in every direction, as if the world beyond it no longer existed. The air grew colder. The frost beneath our feet had hardened into ice, slick and treacherous. My breath came in short bursts, visible in the air like smoke. Her hand brushed against mine, clammy and shaking. We didn't stop moving. At some point the footsteps grew louder, closer. It felt as though whatever or whoever it was had closed the gap between us. I started to think I could hear breathing, not ours. This was heavier, raspier, like the exhale of something not quite human. She tripped, falling hard against the frozen ground. I pulled her up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The noise behind us stopped again, just for a moment, long enough to let the silence fill the space it left behind, a suffocating presence that seemed to squeeze the air from my lungs. And then it started again, closer this time. We ran, the sort of running that feels clumsy and desperate, legs threatening to give out beneath you with every stride. The path blurred around us, the trees twisting into strange, skeletal shapes. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The sound of our pursuer grew louder, closing in. It didn't seem to matter how fast we moved. It wasn't tired, wasn't faltering. We stumbled into a clearing, the sudden openness feeling wrong, like we'd stepped out of one trap and into another. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. The frost sparkled underfoot, bright and blinding against the growing dusk. The forest loomed at the edges of the clearing, watching. Waiting? We couldn't speak. My chest burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hand gripped mine tightly enough to hurt. The clearing was empty, but we weren't alone. The apartment was tiny, but it was mine. After a difficult year of scraping by, It felt good to close the door on the outside world, set my boxes down and breathe in the musty scent of independence. The walls were thin, the heater groaned like an old man, and the single window looked out onto a crumbling alleyway. But it had a certain charm. I convinced myself it did. Moving in just days before New Year's wasn't ideal, but I was eager for a fresh start. By the time the 31st rolled around, most of my things were unpacked, though the place still felt unfamiliar. I hung some fairy lights and popped a cheap bottle of Prosecco into the fridge. A solo celebration wasn't exactly glamorous, but it felt fitting, quiet, reflective, necessary. I hadn't met my neighbors. I'd heard muffled footsteps, the occasional door creaking open, and once the sound of a television playing somewhere above me. The building didn't exactly buzz with life, but I assumed most people had gone away for the holidays or were keeping to themselves. As the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The silence outside my flat grew too pronounced, as if the whole building had taken a breath and held it. I thought nothing of it at first, pouring a glass of wine and watching the minutes tick by on the clock above the kitchen sink. The hum of the fridge was the only company I had. I peeked through the blinds at one point, hoping to catch the glimmer of festive lights from the buildings across the alley. Nothing. No fairy lights, no windows aglow with warmth or laughter. Just darkness, layer upon layer of it, thick as fog. It was close to midnight when I noticed something strange. My hearing sharpened, tuned to the faintest of sounds. At first I thought I imagined it. A rhythmic rise and fall, soft and steady, coming from the other side of my door, breathing, just breathing. I froze. The kind of stillness where your body feels carved from stone. My hand tightened around the stem of the wine glass, the faint imprint of condensation against my palm almost grounding me. Almost. The sound persisted, close enough that I could map its source. It wasn't coming from the floor above or below. It wasn't the hiss of the heater. It was right there, separated from me by just a thin wooden barrier. Inhale, exhale. Too slow to belong to anything mechanical, too regular to be the wind. I stepped back, the floorboards creaking beneath my bare feet. The sound didn't falter, didn't pause. Whoever, whatever, was out there wasn't moving. My eyes flicked to the deadbolt, thankful I'd thought to lock it earlier. But that thin metal lock felt insignificant now, as if a determined push could snap it free. I checked the time. 11:58. Outside the window, the world remained eerily dark. No fireworks lit the sky, no cheers rose from neighboring buildings. Only the hollow, constant presence outside my door remained. I waited. It felt like an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. Then came the knock. Not loud, not hurried, just a single, dull rap, as if to remind me that the breathing hadn't gone anywhere. I backed into the corner of the room, gripping the wine glass like it might serve as a weapon. My breath caught in my throat, threatening to betray me. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. The clock struck midnight. Somewhere in the city, fireworks must have been going off, but in my building, there was nothing. No sounds of celebration, no shouts of joy. Just that suffocating quiet and the faintest sound of air moving beyond the door. When the breathing finally stopped, the silence it left behind was worse. It filled the room like a physical presence, pressing against my skin, crawling up my spine. I didn't move. Couldn't. I stared at the door, expecting something, anything to happen. But nothing did. And then the handle began to turn.